by Elizabeth Lodor Merchant. We continue here with the Foundling Prince. Her skin was as white as the petals of the wood anemones. She wore a white dress adorned with medallions of apple green, and her flowing sleeves were apple green also, and wherever her footsteps fell, 4 white clover heads grew. The moment that the Foundling Prince saw her, he recognized her and fell even more deeply in love with her real self than he had been with the image of her in his fancy. She, too, fell in love with him. Well, I wouldn't use the word falling in love for some sort of social or physical thing alone, but told him she was afraid he could never win her. His only chance, she said, was to ask her father for her hand, and to promise to perform every task which the cruel lord should command. Then she mounted her beautiful white pony and went back to the castle, accompanied for the first half of the way by the Foundling Prince. King Arthur's messengers, who followed her behind, remarked what a handsome pair they made. The lord of the castle was a terrible-looking man, almost hidden in his own wild long hair. 3 times he tried to drive Arthur's messengers away with poisoned arrows, but each time they caught the arrows and flung them back at the lord. So, at last, he was very badly hurt by the arrows. He bade them declare their desire. Then Arthur's warriors put the Foundling Prince in a chair, there opposite the great chair in which sat the cruel lord, and the two began to argue one against the other. "You must root up the whole of that hill yonder," said the father of the prince, Olwen. "You must plough it and sow it in one day, and in one day the wheat must grow and ripen. Of that wheat only shall bread be baked for my daughter's wedding. All this must be done in one day." Now, if this was nowadays, we'd be thinking, "You've been watching too many movies, man. This doesn't happen." But fairy tales. "It will be quite easy for me to do this, though you may think it difficult," answered the Foundling Prince, remembering what Olwen had told him about promising to do all that he was asked, though he saw very little chance of keeping his word. "This may be easy, but there are other things that you cannot do. Only 2 men in the world can till the land and rid it of its stones. Neither of these will come for you, and you will not be able to make them. Another man has in his possession the only oxen that can possibly draw a plow over such wild country. He will not give them up to you, and you will not be able to get them. When first I met Olwen's mother, 9 bushels of flax were sown, and from the seed not a blade came up. I require you to recover the flax and to sow it again in the wild land, tilled by the men who will not come, and plowed by the oxen you cannot get. When the flax is grown, it must make the linen for the headdress my daughter is to wear at her wedding. It will be perfectly easy for me to do all these things," cried the Foundling Prince valiantly, "although you do not think it is easy. You may be able to sow the flax and to reap it in time for the linen headdress to be made, which my daughter is to wear at her wedding," said the lord of the castle, "but there are other things you certainly cannot do. Yet I require that they be done. I want honey that is 9 times sweeter than comb honey, to be put into the marriage drink, and I must have the famous cup of which so many stories are told to hold the sweet draught of wine. Then I will eat of no dish at the wedding supper, but only out of the basket of plenty, into which any man in the world may dip his hand and bring out the food he likes best. Also, you must bring me the fairy horn, and the fairy harp, and the fairy cauldron, of which all the world has heard tell. See, Celtic stories are being weaved in here. Harp of the Dagda, and the fairy horn will pour out the wine. The fairy harp will play without a musician, and in the fairy cauldron meat may be boiled without a fire. Then I must certainly wash my head and shave my beard for the ceremony, and I can shave only with the great boar's razor, nor can I spread out my hair in order to wash it unless I have blood from the jet black witch. All these things I can easily get for you, boasted the Foundling Prince, looking severely at the Lord's extremely matted and untidy beard and hair. I shall want fresh milk, too, for some of my guests, and nobody has ever yet been able to carry fresh milk into the castle. It always turns sour. There are some magical bottles in which it can possibly be kept sweet, but it is impossible for you to find them. I will find the magical bottles and bring the milk, cried the Foundling Prince, loudly and firmly. Yes, but even if I wash my head, my hair is so thick and matted, I can comb it only with the fairy comb, and cut off its ends with the fairy scissors that hang between the two ears of the great enchanted boar, who also carries the razor. It will be perfectly easy for me to hunt the great enchanted boar and bring you the comb and scissors as well as the razor, shouted the Foundling Prince at the top of his voice. In order to do so, you will want the fairy hound and the fairy leash to hold him, and the fairy collar and chain, and the great huntsman whose name is Mabon, who was stolen from his mother when he was 3 days old, and has been lost ever since. Whatever else can do you certainly cannot find Mabon. It will be the easiest thing in the world for me to find Mabon. What else is there for me to do? Demanded the persistent lover of the Princess Olwen. It appeared that there were various other things for him to do, one of which was to persuade King Arthur to join in the hunt after the enchanted boar with the razor, which was fastened to its tusk, and the comb and scissors between its ears. The lord of the castle was quite sure that King Arthur would refuse to do any such thing, but the Foundling Prince knew better. His task, last of all, was to bring Olwen's father the sword of a terrible giant. This giant would be slain only by his sword, and would certainly kill anyone who tried to steal it from him. But the Foundling Prince was not daunted, even by the thought of the giant. My lord and kinsman, King Arthur will obtain all these marvels for me, he cried fearlessly. I will have not only your daughter, O great lord, with unkempt hair, but I will have also your life. So saying, he departed from the castle, and all King Arthur's warriors departed with him. They journeyed for a whole day, and in the evening arrived at another castle, where a giant who was as black as ebony met them at the gate. When they asked him whose castle it was, he said that it belonged to the giant with the mighty sword, and nobody who went into it ever came out alive. In spite of that, Arthur's warriors went on and knocked at the door. The porter who sat inside called out to them that nobody could be admitted unless he could do something nobody else could do so well. Whereupon Sir Kay, who was among the warriors, answered that he was the finest polisher of swords in the world. The porter carried the news to the giant, who replied that his sword very badly needed polishing, and ordered that Sir Kay should be admitted. So Sir Kay was let into the castle, and the sword was given into his hand, and after polishing it and making it very sharp, he slipped behind the giant and cut off his head. Then all the warriors rushed into the giant's castle and took the gold and silver that were hidden in it. With this treasure and with the great sword, they traveled back to Arthur's court and told him the whole story. And when Arthur heard of the other marvels that had to be performed, he asked which of them had better be undertaken first. In answer, the warriors told him that it would be best for him to find Mabon, the lost huntsman, who was stolen from his mother when he was 3 days old. Now, of course, Mabon had been stolen by the fairy people, and only the fairy people would be able to tell of his hiding place. Very close to the fairy people lived the birds in the trees, and the stags on the mountains, and the salmon in the rivers. So first of all, the warriors went in search of the talking blackbird. So why are humans not, if humans have choice and jinn have choice, why would the animals be closer to them? Search of the talking blackbird. They found the blackbird flying about a glen, and when they asked her where Mabon could be found, she said that she would show them the way to a certain fairy stag who might be able to help them, as he was many years older than she. So off they set to find the fairy stag. When they found him, they told him that they were messengers of Arthur, and that they were seeking Mabon, who had been stolen from his mother when he was 3 days old. The stag answered that he did not know where Mabon was, but there was an owl who was much older than he, and who might possibly be able to answer their questions. As they were Arthur's messengers, he added, he would lead them to the owl. Once more they formed a procession, with the stag and the blackbird in front, and moved over the hills till they found the fairy owl. But the owl could not tell them where Mabon had been hidden. All he could do was to lead them to another bird, still older than himself, the great eagle of the crags. And the eagle it was who told them of the great and wonderful fairy salmon. The eagle had once tried to kill the salmon, but they had become friends afterwards, and so, when the mighty bird led Arthur's messengers to the mighty fish, the salmon answered that he knew where Mabon was, and he took 2 of the messengers upon his wide silver shoulders, and swam up the river with them to the stone walls of an old city. And there they heard somebody crying and lamenting in a dungeon, and it was Mabon, who had been stolen from his mother when he was only 3 days old. Then the warriors went back to Arthur's court, and the king gathered together an army and came to the old stone city and attacked the dungeon. After he had captured it, he set Mabon free and took him home to his own castle. And then they all began to ask each other which marvel would be the best to seek next, now that Mabon had been set free. This time they thought that they would seek out a certain she-wolf who had 2 wolf cubs. Remember the Golden Dawn tarot card for the Fool, the wolves, and the baby? That she took hunting with her. The cubs were really enchanted men, and it would help everybody if they were set free. So they found the she-wolf, and Arthur set free the wolf cubs, who would certainly, had they remained in wolf shapes, have interfered in the chase after the great boar with the razor fastened to his tusk, and the fairy comb and scissors hanging between his 2 ears. Remember, a boar is not something in modern religion that you're allowed to eat unless you're starving to death. On the way back from this adventure with the she-wolf, one of Arthur's warriors saved a whole ant hill full of ants from being burned by a great fire that was sweeping over the country. And the ants were so grateful that they burrowed into the earth and brought out every seed of the 9 bushels of flaxseed that the Foundling prince had promised to take back to the father of Prince Olwen. Everything seemed to be going well, and the marvels were really being performed one by one. But the fairy hound and the fairy leash and the fairy collar still had to be discovered. As Sir Kay was talking all this over with Sir Bedivere, however that's supposed to be pronounced, they suddenly saw a great smoke from a great fire, and they thought it might be the fire of a robber. They hurried off in the direction of the fire, and there, sure enough, was the greatest robber that Arthur had ever hunted, roasting some boar's flesh on a spit. And Sir Kay, pointing to the robber's beard, whispered to Sir Bedivere that the only living hairs from that beard that only the living hairs from that beard could make the fairy leash that would hold the fairy hound, with which Mabon must hunt the enchanted boar, who carried the comb and the scissors between his ears and the razor on his tusk. Now, I've definitely witnessed by video, not people I've interviewed for the channel, but people talking about how they needed particular things of particular types of corpses for their magic, and for people to have to kill somebody to do such, that is certainly something that's, well, one of the guests on my channel did say that sometimes it's necessary for the shayateen to do their magic. But so the two warriors, hunt the enchanted boar, carried the comb and the scissors between his ears and the razor on his tusk. Okay. So the two warriors hid themselves until the robber had eaten so much supper that he fell fast asleep. Then they stole up to him and actually managed not only to dig a great pit under his feet while he slept, but to tip him into it without waking him up. When he was fast in the pit, they plucked out the hairs of his beard and then killed him outright. And, as he was a very wicked robber indeed, the world was better for his death. Well, as long as they knew that beforehand. Carrying the leash, which they had made of the robber's beard, they returned to Arthur's court. Now, said King Arthur, what is to be the next marvel? And they were all agreed immediately that it was to be the capture of the fairy hound. They had to search through many countries, but at last they found the fairy hound in the enchanted forest itself, and took it home to Arthur's castle. And now they were all ready to hunt the boar with the comb and the scissors and the razor. But this boar was such an enormous and terrible animal that Arthur said they would not set out upon the hunt until they were quite sure it really had the comb and scissors hanging between its ears. So he made one of his knights take the form of a bird, and in this form fly to the mountain where the enchanted boar was hidden. The bird knight flew right down on top of the boar's den, and indeed there were the comb and the scissors and the razor. But when he tried to snatch them in his bird claws, he only succeeded in getting hold of one of the boar's bristles, which made the fierce creature seem very angry indeed. For a time now, Arthur decided to leave the boar alone and to obtain the magic cauldron. Now the cauldron was in the house of a great king, who kept all his money in it, and entirely refused to part with it at Arthur's request. So Arthur made a war on him, and conquered him, and carried away the cauldron, money and all. You know, there's reasons why the Bible says don't covet. And other religions too. And by this time, everybody was amazed at the things that King Arthur would do, rather than break his promise to the Foundling prince who wanted to marry the Princess Olwen. And now the king had a ride for the great hunting, but all the enchanted boars of the country heard of it, and turned out themselves to fight the warriors of Arthur's court. Chief among these great boars was a huge beast with bristles like silver wire, that made a shining trail as he rushed through the trees. Arthur's warriors and Mabon and the fairy hound had terrible battles with the boars, but at last the great beast with the comb and the scissors and the razor was driven into the river, not far from the very city where Mabon had been found by the two knights who rode on the shoulders of the fairy salmon. Then, while the huge creature lashed the water, Mabon himself sprang upon it and snatched the razor from its tusk, and hid it under his shirt. But nobody could reach the comb and the scissors until a very brave warrior followed Mabon into the water and managed to get hold of the scissors. However, before either man could secure the comb, the boar scrambled out of the water and galloped off, never stopping for at least 100 miles. Then King Arthur himself set off after it, with a whole host of knights. And at last they overtook it, and, after a terrific fight, got possession of the comb, while the enchanted boar was driven into the ocean and never was seen again. Then King Arthur and his warriors took a short rest, after which the king asked if there were any more marvels to be performed. And his knights answered, the blood of the Black Witch, had yet to be obtained. So the king set off in search of the Black Witch, and found her hiding in a cave. And she nearly killed 2 of the warriors the moment they entered her hiding place. But King Arthur instantly took his sword and leaped into the cave and cut the ugly Black Witch in 2. And one of his attendants took the fairy blood and put it into a fairy basin to take to the father of the Princess Olwen. Well, that's sort of the definition of honor killing. It's like, I must maintain my honor by killing people. That's not a reason why I would support killing people. Now, as Arthur's messengers had secured the witch's blood and the magical razor and the fairy comb and scissors, they thought that the other task might wait a while. And they all went back to the horrible lord's castle with their spoils. They sprinkled his hair and beard with the witch's blood, and then, in spite of his struggles, cut both of them off and shaved him as clean as an ivory ball. Then, as the loss of his hair and beard made him quite helpless, they found it easy to chop off his head with the giant's sword, whereupon they took possession of the castle, and all the gold and silver and jewels that were hidden in it. As the father of the princess was dead, there was really no need now to trouble about the other marvels that had been declared were to be performed for her wedding day. The Foundling Prince therefore married her without performing them, and he and his bride and Arthur's knights and warriors made festival for at least a week in the castle. And for hundreds of years afterwards, all the old folk of the countryside would tell of the marvels which were performed at the command of the good King Arthur, in order that the Foundling Prince might marry the Princess Olwen. Now, a chaste, unmarried woman, when she's finally married, it's sort of the duty of the husband to stick around for a good week. I mean, sometimes a war is called off, and it becomes necessary to fend off one's life or something like that, and women tend to excuse that sort of thing, but anyways, that's, maybe it's postponed or something, but there's various traditions like that there's a right of, well, the man sticks around for, at least this long before he gets off and does something else. A few days, a previous married woman in the Islamic tradition, by the way. Nobody rejoiced more at the performance of these marvels and the success of the Foundling Prince than did the blackbird and the stag, the owl, the eagle, and the salmon, all of whom had helped Arthur's knights to discover the place where Mabon was kept in prison. These fairy animals, as you know, were very, very old. So old that they could hardly remember the time when they were young, and they had lived among the mountains and valleys for hundreds of years. The blackbird judged of time by a smith's anvil near which she always built her nest. No smith had worked at the anvil since she came there, but every evening she had sharpened her beak upon it, and by the time Arthur's messengers came, the anvil had been worn down to the size of a nut. As for the stag, he sheltered each night under an oak sapling, and had watched it grow into a great oak with 100 branches, and then wither away and die. But the owl, who was much, much older, had come when the whole valley was a wooded glen, and had seen a race of men root up the trees and plant others, and the remote descendants, and again theirs, do the same, so that the wood in which the owl was now sheltered was the 4th wood. As for the eagle, he had set for hundreds of years upon a crag, once so high that he could peck at the stars, and which was now but a yard above the ground. When the salmon had been speared with 50 spears, which he carried about in his silver back, until the eagle pulled them out for him. Everybody in those days knew the stories of the owl and the blackbird, and the stag and the eagle and the salmon, for these fairy animals had relations who lived in the enchanted forest, and the stag was first cousin to the white stag of the fairy hunt. There is little doubt that Merlin had ridden upon his back of a moonlit night, followed by the beautiful hens and fawns. As for the salmon, he was the most wonderful of all these old creatures, and the reason why he had so many spears in his back was because many hunters had sought for him in the rocky pools, and thrust their long spears into him to try to bring him to land. But he had always broken away, for he was the greatest fairy salmon living, and he knew most of the secrets of the world. The fishes caught by the rich fisher were the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the salmon, and King Arthur knew very well what a wonderful thing it was that such a mighty and mysterious fish should have given his help towards enabling the Foundling Prince to marry the Princess Olwen. And little do people know that djinn have respite. We can't just throw weapons at them and hurt them.